So today, as we discuss some issues going forward, to do that, of course, we have to understand where we are. But as Keynes reminded us, to understand where we are, we need to know how we came to this point. So you'll see a little bit of history in my presentation at the beginning. The story is about 3 quotes and 5 pictures. This is the chart of a very important economic variable. Some of you may already know what this is. If not, just be patient for a while because I'll explain that later. But the first quote is that infamous quote. It's often ascribed to Henry Kissinger. The poor guy did not actually say this. He was chairing the meeting in the US State Department where someone called Mr. Johnson said, this was in December. In early December, when it was clear that Bangladesh is going to become independent, I think it was on the 4th or 5th. So they were discussing the prospects of Bangladesh once Bangladesh gets independent. And at that time, they were very concerned about the fact that the winter months are usually bad months. We did not have the Boro crop at that time. So this was usually a time when there used to be a lot of food shortage. So they were discussing what to do about it. And Mr. Johnson said, well, I'm afraid Bangladesh would probably be an international basket case. And Kissinger said, yes, but not necessarily our basket case. So I don't know exactly what he meant, but that's what he said. But because of that, Kissinger has been tagged as the person who said that, but it was actually Mr. Johnson. If we fast forward, let's say 47 years or so, or 37 actually, Goldman Sachs in 2007 said they were identifying the next group of important countries who could challenge the G7 countries. And they came up with a list of 11 countries, and Bangladesh was one. So it's a big change between the time when Bangladesh was described as a basket case to the point where Goldman Sachs is identifying us as one of the most exciting economies going forward. But what about the US State Department, where that infamous comment was made first? A few months ago, this is what I saw on their website. I don't know if it's still there, but a few months ago it was there. Bangladesh has achieved decades of impressive economic growth. Its enviable growth and openness to US private sector investment makes the market a standout opportunity for US firms. Now, that's from the perspective of US investment. That's not necessarily how we will all talk about Bangladesh's progress, but it's remarkable that the same department which 50 years ago made that infamous comment is now calling us a standout opportunity for US firms. So how do we come from there to here? And that's what I meant by the three quotes you have heard, and we'll come to the 5 pictures. But before that, something on the big picture. So here are the 5 pictures actually. The first one is irrigation. It's an irrigation pump, you can recognize. These are migrant workers, so the story will be about remittances. This is about female education. This is about rural roads. This is a typical road in rural Bangladesh. And this, of course, you'll recognize is somebody working in the garment industry. So the 5 stories that I'll start with. But before that, a bit of the big picture. So that's the graph I was referring to. That's the GDP growth rate of Bangladesh from around 1961 to around 2019. And the thing that will strike you is that this 60-year period can be divided into 3 phases. So the first phase, widely fluctuating growth rate. 6-7% one year, minus 3% another year, fluctuations. That was the first 20 years or so. The next 20 years, from the early 80s to sort of the turn of the century, the growth rate becomes much more stable, but on average modest, 2 to 3%, not much more than that. And then at the turn of the century, and those vertical marks are supposed to give you the start and end points, and then of course there can be some debate on whether that's the right transitional point. But now, at the turn of the century, we have entered a phase of accelerating GDP growth. There is some concern whether we can maintain it, but that has been the feature. So clearly 3 distinct phases, as I said, in the 60-year growth history. And there are very few countries in the world who have managed to achieve this kind of stable growth for such a long period of time. So that's important. So that's quite an impressive growth record. So that's growth. I mean, I'm not talking about development as a whole, but that's economic growth. But that has also been accompanied by a reduction in poverty, because I'm sure you will ask, okay, growth, but so what? What has happened to poverty? The blue line are the aggregate, the red is rural, and the gray is urban. And economists usually have two different measures. One is poverty, and the other is extreme poverty. However you measure it, clearly there has been a decline in the last 20 years or so, or even more than that, in all three measures of poverty. One interesting point, you will see that while rural poverty has continued to decrease, urban poverty in recent years hasn't really decreased. It's sort of stagnating. And I know BRAC is also very concerned about the fact that not only there are so many urban poor, but it seems that that rate of poverty reduction has slowed down. So poor people do not necessarily live in rural areas only. So the urban poverty has become a concern. So now coming to the stories behind this big picture. So the first one is about agriculture. We usually don't talk much about what's happening in the rural economy, but one of the remarkable aspects of Bangladesh's development is the agricultural growth story. So that's the crop production index, which is an average of the production trends of different crops. And the blue line shows the index itself, and the red line shows the per capita, the index of per capita food production. And you can see the steady rise, and in fact, again, around the turn of the century, you see an acceleration in that blue line. And you can also see that while for a long time, the crop production sort of kept pace with population growth, so the per capita was more or less stagnant, but then again, we start seeing an increase. And that's because of two reasons. One is that crop production itself started growing at a faster rate, but also because the population growth rate fell. So the combined effect of the two is reflected in the significant increase in per capita crop production. And why did it happen? It happened because farmers started grabbing opportunities. Farmers started responding to opportunities, price opportunities, profitability opportunities. And what you see here is the emergence of the third crop, which is the Boro crop. And you can see that that orange one is the Boro, and you see how significantly it has gone up in recent years. That's a major development in the rice crop sector of Bangladesh. But another thing has happened. As I said, farmers are responding to price opportunities. So that has led to a reallocation of resources, reallocation of land between crops. And one good example of this is the changing fortunes of sugarcane production versus rice production. So as rice production, it's potato, actually it's more dramatic in the case of potato. So as potato production went up, you see sugarcane production is going down. I'm not saying there's necessarily a link between the two, but this kind of story can be shown for various crops. Production of certain crops have gone up and production of certain crops have gone down, while on average crop production has gone up. So it says that the Bangladeshi farmers are increasingly responding to market incentives, and that's an important part of the story. And in all of this, irrigation played a major role. So Boro, for example, we could not have achieved what we have in the winter in the absence of irrigation. So the spread of irrigation has been a major part of the story, and irrigation combined with fertilizer was a major part of the adoption of high-yielding variety of rice. So irrigation played a major role, and that's why I had that picture of an irrigation park. Now, rural is not just agriculture. So this was about agriculture. But what has happened? So first you have the rice crop. We saw the changes within rice. But then you have other crops. I gave an example of potato there. We have significant increase in vegetable as well. But then you have non-crop agriculture, which I haven't mentioned, but fisheries, poultry, livestock, those have also increased. And then you have non-farm rural activities. So that's an example of a very traditional non-farm, but there have been many other changes. And one way to look at it is to see of the total employment in rural areas, how much is in agriculture and how much is in non-farm rural activities. And you can see how that was the non-farm, and you see how the proportion of employment in non-farm has increased and caught up with farm employment. And this has also helped to reduce poverty, because a lot of poor people are now having additional sources of income. In fact, many people have one foot in farming and another in non-farm agriculture. And this expansion of opportunities in the rural area has been a major driver of the poverty reduction story that I mentioned before. Now, this is from Jeffrey Sachs. He was visiting the famous economist. He was once in Dhaka, and one morning from his hotel room, this is the kind of picture he saw. So this, as you can well recognize, is the story of the garment workers in Bangladesh. So that chart over there, I wish I had a picture with Argentina. Brazil is probably a bit irrelevant, but I couldn't find one, but I found that one on Brazil. But you can see the significant increase in total exports over time. And the light blue bar is the garment export. So you can clearly see that much of the export expansion in Bangladesh is because of garments. Now, interestingly, within garments, you have just 5 broad product groups, which constitute 75% of garments. So there's a double diversification challenge here. How can we diversify away from garments, but also how can we diversify within garments? Because there are thousands of garment products that one can make, but we are still focusing on 5 broad product groups, which includes shirts and trousers and sweaters and all of that. So there's a diversification story over there. This is the one, these are migrant workers, so this is a story of remittances. And it's very interesting. For a long time, remittances were increasing, and then something happened just after the turn of the century, when there's a very significant increase in remittances. Now, these are official remittances. Now, why is it that there is such an expansion in official remittances? And this is a very burning topic of now, because we are always hearing about how remittances are coming through unofficial channels and not. I was actually talking to the person who was the finance secretary at that time. I was just talking to him a few days ago. And he told me about a number of measures that were taken at that time to encourage people to transfer their remittances not through hundis, but through the official channel. And this could be part of the story behind this. So that's an example of how policy interventions can have an impact on economic transactions. Now, remittances, most of it go, not the poorest, but a lot of poor families are major recipients of remittances. And therefore, this huge inflow of remittances have also played a major role in the poverty reduction story. This is rural roads, and this is very interesting. The gray bar over there, these are the so-called feeder roads. So you have the national highways which link cities like Dhaka and Chittagong and Khulna and all that. And then you have the roads which link the district towns. And then you have the feeder roads which link the villages to the small towns and the slightly larger towns, and therefore the whole country. There was a major expansion of feeder roads starting in the late 80s and continuing in the 90s. And a lot of people say that the dynamism in agriculture that I talked about owes a lot to the tremendous expansion of feeder roads, because it increased connectivity. It increased the markets that the farmers could access. So that is entirely public sector. Now, last year, on the 50th anniversary of Bangladesh, there were lots of writings on Bangladesh. And a lot of foreign experts, including very well-known professors, when they will write about Bangladesh's story, they would often use the phrase, despite the government. So all this development has happened despite the government. It has happened because of NGOs like BRAC, it has happened because of the private sector, but despite the government. And I think that's a very misleading interpretation. And this is one good example. This not happened because of NGOs or the private sector, it happened because of the government. And this had a major role in agricultural transformation. And this is female education. I'm sure many of you are familiar. That's only one aspect of the very impressive progress on social indicators. The bottom one is about life expectancy. So Bangladeshis can now expect to live longer. And the top one is the under 5 mortality rate, that famous story that many of you or most of you know. A significant decrease in under 5 mortality rates that we have achieved. A sideline to the story is that in some of these cases, the gap between women and men have also decreased. And this is a good example of that. So the educational attainment rates have gone up, but especially for girls. So if you look at the diagrams there, the gap between boys and girls have progressively gone down over there. So not only has school attendance gone up, it's gone up more rapidly for girls. So that's another important aspect of the development story. And this is where both government and citizens have played an important role. Government and NGOs, but also citizens paying out of their own pocket. So this is a great example of how different actors, government, NGOs, and citizens themselves have contributed together to achieve certain outcomes. And I think that concept of synergy between the contributions of different actors is an important message I want to leave behind. And there will be a few more slides on this concept of synergies. So, and that's exactly what I was saying right now. So all these outcomes that we talked about, some are purely economic, some are more social. The government has had an important role through policy, through public spending. So the rural road infrastructure is a great example of public spending, through regulations and through establishing a rule of law. Now this is all not perfect, but the government has played some important role. And then of course you have the private sector through their investment, through their job creation, through the supply of various goods and services, the private sector, and then of course finally the NGOs like BRAC and Grameen Bank and many other NGOs have played a role. And again, as I said, we must recognize that there are synergies between the activities of these three players, and that's very important to recognize. So here's an example of the power of synergies. This is from the rural economy. So this is the expansion of rural roads, the feeder roads that I mentioned. It looks less dramatic here because the scale is different. And you can see the big jump in the late 80s and in the 90s. This is the remittance story. Now the real acceleration happened later after that vertical line that I have, which is around the late 90s. But even before that, there has been a substantial inflow of remittances. And this is the irrigation, the expansion of irrigation in Bangladesh, which is a more steady pattern. What I'm saying is that if you place yourself where the vertical line is, which is the late 1990s, you can see what has been happening before that. Your connectivity has increased because of the feeder road network. Your irrigation expansion has been about fourfold or fivefold. And a lot of money has come in over the years in the form of remittances. And I'm arguing that these three forces, or maybe there were a few others, have created a synergistic impact on the agriculture. And that's reflected in the crop production index that I mentioned. You can see an acceleration after the late 90s. And I'm suggesting that the accumulation of the synergies from before resulted in this. So the concept of synergy, where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, I think is a very important part of the story of Bangladesh's development. And I think this is something that you may also want to explore and do research on. But I think this is something that has not been appreciated enough. And as I said, the synergies have originated partly in government, partly the private sector, partly NGOs, and partly just the creativity and resilience of ordinary citizens. But the synergy story, I think is very important. So that was part of my presentation, which was on just giving you a history of the development journey so far and some aspects of it. I mean, there are many other dimensions which obviously I couldn't cover. Now I was wondering whether for 2 or 3 minutes ask any questions, or I should just go on. Okay, so that was the first part. Now, an important thing, an important driver of all this that I want to highlight is the unleashing of the entrepreneurial spirit. The Bangladeshis were not known, or Bengalis in general were not known to be entrepreneurial. We had many other good attributes, but being an entrepreneur was not one of them. But this is something significant that has happened after independence, the unleashing of the entrepreneurial spirit. And in a sense, we should not be very surprised at this. The famous economist, Hirschman, well, he said that it's often believed that developing countries do not have a pool of entrepreneurs. Developed countries do. So you can see a lot of entrepreneurial activity. But in 1956, when he wrote his famous book, The Strategy of Economic Development, Hirschman said, no, these countries like Bangladesh, they have a reservoir of entrepreneurs. They have latent entrepreneurship in these countries. So he called them a reserve army of entrepreneurs. And the challenge for government is to create the conditions, the incentives, to bring this latent entrepreneurship out into the open. And that is what public policy should be about. So entrepreneurship is there in almost all societies. The question is, can you bring that out? Somehow that latent entrepreneurship has come out in Bangladesh. And even people who were once a bit skeptical about the entrepreneurial potential of Bangladesh has recognized this. And one of this is my Professor Rehman Subhan. Many of you may know that in '72 he was one of the key people behind the policy to nationalize industries. And one of the arguments he gave was that in Bangladesh, entrepreneurship is not going to happen unless there's a lot of support from government. And if government has to give a lot of support, what's the point in having private enterprise? Why not have everything under public ownership? That was, of course, based on the experience during the Pakistan time. But in his second volume, the second volume of his autobiography, just published about a year ago, he talks about the emergence of new social forces since independence. And he says that Bangladesh has registered changes in its economic fortunes in a more transformational nature than many other post-colonial societies. And that's because of the emergence of new social forces. And one of the social forces he talks about is entrepreneurship. So it's very interesting that Professor Subhan, who was once skeptical about the possibilities of entrepreneurship, is now recognizing that as one of the major social developments in Bangladesh. As I said, one should not be surprised at this, not just because Albert Hirschman said this, but also because one of our own, Dr. Akbar Ali Khan, who I believe was associated with the university, he has a book called The Discovery of Bangladesh. I don't know how many of you have read it. I would strongly recommend that book, published I think in '96. He takes a very historical look, and he says something interesting. He's looking at the structure of villages in different parts of South Asia. And he says that in most of South Asia, the villages were of a corporate structure. You had a big landlord, a zamindar at the top, a hierarchical structure, and large projects like irrigation projects used to be done in a hierarchical way, in a top-down way. But in Bangladesh, and in particular, he's talking about Bangladesh, so he makes a distinction between West Bengal and East Bengal. In Bangladesh, because of the natural rain-fed irrigation system, we did not need all those hierarchical structures. So Bangladesh had traditional, non-conventional ideas. Now, I'll be keen to know whether you agree or not, but that was his position. And if that is the case, if people are individualistic, if new ideas, unconventional ideas are not frowned upon, then it's not a surprise that we can't have entrepreneurship. Because these things are at the heart of entrepreneurship: individualism, welcoming new ideas, willing to take risks. And therefore, perhaps we can say that the entrepreneurial spirit, whose unleashing I mentioned at the beginning, is perhaps deeply rooted in our own history. So for some reason it was suppressed earlier, but in independent Bangladesh it got an opportunity to come out. So this is a story of the transition to a private sector-led approach. This is the private sector credit as a percentage of total credit. I chose that variable because it shows very dramatically where we started when we went for a socialist form of economy. As you can see, only 20% of bank credit was going to the private sector in the early 70s. And then you have a transitional period from the mid-70s to roughly about, I think it's the late 80s. And after that, it sort of settles between 70 and 90%. So there's a transitional period there when we moved from a more socialistic economic stance to a more private sector oriented stance. So a number of things happened. I'm not going into that. There were lots of debates which ultimately led to this transition. So now this is probably one of my most important slides. It's a bit dense and I'll take a little bit of time explaining it. What I'm suggesting is that if we look at the history of Bangladesh, you'll see examples of what I call entrepreneurial waves coming one after the other. So let's start with the very important part. In the early 70s, as I said, farmers started adopting the new variety, the high-yielding variety rice. Now, this is not something their parents or grandparents had done. So this was a risky venture in some way. And it's very interesting that it's actually the small farmers who adopted it more than the large farmers. There are empirical studies which have established it. So people who take risks, who go into new things, which their ancestors hadn't done, are clearly entrepreneurial. So that one of the first examples of entrepreneurship in the independent Bangladesh is when small farmers started adopting HYB rice. And later, as I was explaining, there was diversification into other crops. And that happened, let's say, in the 80s or onwards. And then later on, there was diversification into fishing and poultry. So we went from the traditional fishing activity, traditional poultry, into more commercial fishing and poultry. Now, while that was happening in the agriculture, with the crop agriculture or long-term agriculture, something was happening in response to that. So as farmers started adopting irrigation, you needed people to come and repair your irrigation machines. You needed people to even manufacture irrigation equipment and whatnot. So you see that the next level is about that. When there was significant increase in potato production, one of the challenges was storage, because the traditional storage could not handle so much of potato production. So people came in, entrepreneurs came in and set up cold storages. And when the cold storages were established, that gave a further boost to potato production, which in turn gave a further boost to cold storage establishment. I have other charts which show how the two things went together. As fishery and poultry developed, we have entrepreneurs coming in, setting up hatcheries and fish feed farms. So this is another group of entrepreneurs. So you see the farmers are becoming entrepreneurial, going into different activities, and to serve them, we have another group of entrepreneurs. Many of them came from the farming community itself, but some may have come from outside the villages. But you can see the new waves of entrepreneurs. And then, of course, I'm not going into details. You have a trading, I actually can't see it very clear from here. But you can see examples. You have ready-made garments as an export, and then you have specialized jute yarn, which I'll mention in a moment. You have bicycle exports. And then later on, if you go to the top, you have, at the end of the day, you have internet services, then mobile financial services came, bKash and all that, and then you have e-commerce. So if you look at that, you see how there have been waves of entrepreneurship, starting with agriculture, industry, and now in the technology-related sectors of Bangladesh. And that, I think, in a way, tells you about how the entrepreneurial potential has been unleashed. You can look at other countries and you may see that this series of waves haven't happened. So things may have happened in agriculture, but those supporting activities may not have happened. So they got stuck somewhere. In Bangladesh, somehow, things led to other things. And that's why I'm calling it the unleashing of the entrepreneurial spirit leading to this kind of entrepreneurial waves. And that's a very important part of the development story, and I feel that it is still underappreciated, the role of entrepreneurship, the role of these kind of entrepreneurial waves in Bangladesh. Now, this entrepreneurship has been across the board. So I was talking about the small farmers, from the small farmers to the large conglomerates. It's across the board. So let's take an example of a conglomerate. The journey of a conglomerate. This is the Anwar group of industries. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this. Anwar Group, I have arranged them. If you go to their websites, many of them have got lists of the various activities that they entered into at different times. We have the time dimension at the bottom, and we have different sectors in some order of complexity. We start from simpler to more complex. Now, when you look at this picture like this, it seems that these guys are just all over the place. They're into all kinds of activities. And in fact, whenever I meet these people and they give me their business cards, I used to be amused at how long the list of their activities was. I always used to have this question, are they all over the place, or is there some logic in this apparent madness? And in fact, there is. And that's the story I want to tell you here. So Mr. Alwa Hussain, who passed away a few years ago, started with some simple products. And one iconic product was a silk sari. And his son, Khalid Hussain, was telling me the story. He felt that in Bangladesh, when daughters of the richer families get married, they of course have the kaftan saris and many other varieties. He may probably know the whole list, but I don't. And he said, but what about the lower income and the poor? They also have their desires. Can I come up with a sari which is reasonably glamorous, but which is relatively cheap? And if I can make it on a mass scale, of course the cost will be less. So he came up with his iconic Mala Shari, which was named after his daughter. And like the Akis Biri, which of course is, you may have a debate on the utility of the Biri, but these are examples of mass products that when you produce it at the scale at which you can sell in Bangladesh, the average cost will be quite low. Starting with that, he also had a few other things like cutleries and also cables for some reason. And then you see how he expands horizontally. So from Malashani, he goes into dyeing, printing, and I can't say very clearly, but I think he goes into yarn as well. That blue was wool ones there, the darker blue ones. Then from the cables, he goes into iron and steel, he goes into cement as the one on the top. In the late 70s, he led a delegation and met Ziaur Rahman and said, look here, you want to promote the private sector, but you can't do it if all your banks are nationalized. So they start talking about private banks. And then when Ershad came to power, finally, he started allowing private banks. And one of the first private banks, Anwar Hussain, was involved in it. So it started with banks, and now it's a go. If you look at there, I think it's the green one probably. He went into other activities in the financial sector. So I have a similar charge for about a dozen of the business houses because they all have this information at their websites. And it's very interesting to see the logic of their expansion. Now, in some cases, people have actually gone into activities which didn't make sense, and therefore some of the business houses are actually in trouble because they diversified in a way that didn't make sense. But I just wanted to show you, to just give a flavor of the fact that the entrepreneurial spirit has been unleashed across the board, from small farms to large conglomerates. So this is entrepreneurship. Now, policy actions facilitated that. This did not happen in a vacuum. So policy actions and also actions by both government but also by NGOs help develop the markets, the value chains, which are fostered by entrepreneurship. Policy actions, market development, and entrepreneurship. And I'll give a few examples of this before I go into the last section of my presentation, which is the challenges ahead. Now this is maize production. So you will see in the early years, not much of maize production. And then something happens. And by the way, in the research that Samia mentioned that I'm doing, which may lead to a book one day, I identify a number of these what I call great accelerations. So a variable is increasing at a certain rate, modest rate, and then something happens, you have an inflection point, and it just goes like this. And there are many, many variables where you see this. And that's something I'm trying to explore. Why is it that instead of moving at a steady rate, it moves at a sudden slow rate and then suddenly it explodes? So that happened with maize production. And here you see, I don't know how many of you knew this, but BRAC actually has had an important role. So BRAC, as you know, started with their enhancing livelihoods programs with an emphasis on women's livelihoods in the 70s. And one of the things they entered into was maize seed production. And after they entered into that, BRAC at some point wanted to go deeper. So they imported maize seeds which were high yielding. They tried them out, then expanded, and at some point they started making hybrid seeds in Bangladesh. So all this was being done by BRAC. And after it came to a point, you can see the private sector coming in. So you see the entry of ACI happens when maize production has started to take off. But BRAC and also government had a major role in bringing maize production beyond the inflection point, or to the inflection point. And this is another great example of how organizations like BRAC, NGOs like BRAC, in collaboration with government, does certain things in the early stages of the journey of an economic variable, when there are various risks and other factors, because of which the private sector cannot come in. But then they bring it to a point where they demonstrate that this can be profitable business. And then the commercial private sector comes in, because the commercial private sector can scale it up in a way that NGOs cannot. So this is a very good example of that story, of how the market was developed through a number of interventions, some of them by NGOs and government in the early days, and now increasingly by private sector players. Now this is about the jute industry, and I wanted to show it because I think a lot of people have misperception about what has happened to the jute industry. We generally believe that the jute industry has declined, and some people may even say it has been destroyed, and that's actually not true at all. Now if you can look at the Atanji jute mill, yes, it was closed in 2002, and that's one major reason why many of us believe that the jute industry has collapsed in Bangladesh. That's not correct. What happened after Atanji was closed? Firstly, that land has been converted into an export processing zone. So we now have other industries which do not require the subsidy that jute required. It's a very vital export-oriented industry. And the number of jobs that have been created there in the first 10 years after the EPZ was opened is actually 3 times the jobs that were lost when Atanji was closed. So that's a great example of how resources were reallocated to activities which were much more profitable, much more promising. But that's not the end of the story. Atanji still had a lot of equipment, a lot of looms and spindles and all that, which were still in good condition. Not all of them were, but many were. These were bought by a new breed of entrepreneurs. These entrepreneurs set up small jute mills, mostly in the northern areas. Why northern areas? Because that's where a lot of the jute is grown, and it's closer to India. So they are the small jute mills using the Atanji looms and spindles, using the jute grown in those areas, and then exporting the product to India. So another great example of what the famous Austrian economist Schumpeter had called creative destruction. You destroy something because you want to create something. And creation often requires the tough task of destroying something. So this is a story of what happened in Atanji that is not known to many people in Bangladesh. But there's another story in the jute industry. Sometime in, I think towards the end of the century, a lot of jute mills were closing down in Europe. Those factories were bought by entrepreneurial Bangladeshis, many of whom had been in jute previously and some had not been. These were converted into jute yarn. That's a new product, jute yarn, which has a great future, and because of that we see a rise in jute yarn production, even though the conventional jute products like HCM and sacking may have been going down. So these are good examples of death and rebirth, in this case in the jute industry. So this has been another part of the entrepreneurial story, that we are not only creating new things, we are helping to move from old things which may not be profitable anymore, but we are moving to more profitable things. I know that my good friend is a good friend of Hashmi as well, Anu Mohammed, wrote an article around the time Atanji was closed, saying, well, this is the beginning of the deindustrialization of Bangladesh. Well, clearly that hasn't happened, even in the jute industry itself. And underlying it is the story of entrepreneurship. I'd like to say a little bit about policy dynamics, and I think that's important. That's one of the things I'm trying to study. Policy doesn't happen overnight. There are all kinds of dynamics and debates that happen behind the scenes before you see the announcement of a policy. And the model I'm talking about is the following. You have developments in the economy. Something may be happening in the agricultural sector, something may be happening in the industrial sector. And the economic actors are, of course, driving these things. But then the story of these developments, including any problems that the economic actors are facing, the stories come to the government. And it comes in various ways. Government may directly observe what's going on in agriculture, what's going on in industry, and then they say, okay, this is where things are not moving as well as we'd like it to be, so there may be a need for some intervention. Sometimes the economic actors themselves, especially if they have the voice, they would go and tell the government And look here, we are doing this, we can do more, but there are these bottlenecks, these need to be removed. Sometimes there are policy intermediaries, economists like myself, think tanks, donor agencies, the media. They will pick up these problems and make a noise and try to influence government. And because of all these influences, sometimes the governments take policy actions. Now, the interesting thing about Bangladesh is our government has rarely been very bold in taking policy decisions. It has mostly been reactive, it has mostly been incremental. But the interesting thing is that if people say to government, we need these 8 policies, government would say, okay, we are just going to do 3 of them, and we're going to see how the market responds. And if the response is good, we may do more. But the good thing about Bangladesh is that feedback loop has actually worked well. So a government may have taken some policies, and then the market responded, then the government took some more policies, the market responded, the government took some more policies. This hasn't happened in many other countries. The government may have taken some policies, entrepreneurs may have responded, that created demand for more policies, but those did not come. And in some countries, government took the policies, the entrepreneurial response wasn't there in the first place. In Bangladesh, things have not been dramatic, they have been incremental, but they have been incremental wave after wave after wave. And that, I think, is an important part of the policy dynamics of Bangladesh. I'll just take one slide to show this. A major policy action that happened in Bangladesh was the liberalization of the agricultural input market in the late 80s and 90s. So what we had was, I actually can't read them clearly here, but I'll tell the story. As I said, agriculture production was going up, but it was all in a very public sector oriented model. The fertilizer was being imported by the Agricultural Development Corporation, irrigation equipment was being imported, they were being distributed all through a public sector model. And the inefficiency of that model was becoming evident. So demand had grown for some liberalization of that market to allow the private sector to come in. And the government did take some steps in the early 1980s. Those were good steps, but those were not enough. And there was demand for more actions. I mean, those actions triggered some response from farmers. It's not enough, and there was demand for more. And for some reason, the government was slow in doing that. And then in the mid-1980s, agricultural production started slowing down. And the government was concerned. They established a committee to review, and the committee said, look here, I think it's time for you to have voluntary reforms, because otherwise agriculture will just stagnate at the level where it is. And those reforms finally happened in the late 80s and 90s. So a very dense slide, but the story is simple. Things happen in the marketplace, things happen in the real economy, in this case in agriculture. That creates a demand for certain policy actions. The government takes some of them, not all. That leads to some response, but not enough. And then maybe something extraordinary happens. In this case, there was the slowing down of agriculture, but there were also floods in the late 80s. And that finally triggers more substantial reforms. And there are many more examples of this kind of response between what's happening in the real economy and what's happening in the domain of the policymakers. So going forward. So yes, poverty has gone down, incomes have gone up, but there are vulnerabilities. So the poverty reduction has not been even across Bangladesh. There are certain regions where poverty is still high, and the rate of poverty reduction has been slower than the national average. So for a country which was born out of a debate of regional disparity, I think we should be the first to recognize that we don't want any regional disparity. Hopefully, the opening of the Patna Bridge may help a bit, because some of the backward regions are actually in southern Bangladesh. And then there are other vulnerabilities I think I talk about also between the east and western regions. Now, we are very proud that we are becoming a millionaire country. We should be very aware that there are many, many examples of countries which had become middle income and had never graduated from that. We are thinking of becoming a developed country in about 20 years, so jumping from middle to a developed country. That jump has not happened in many, many countries in the world. And this chart shows that. So you have Argentina, South Africa, and South Korea. And you will see Argentina, South Africa, and South Korea were at the same place several years ago. Then Argentina and South Africa, their incomes haven't increased that much, but South Korea has just, graduated from that stage. So it's not obvious that just because you have become middle income, you will become high income. It happens in some cases, and sadly, those are more exceptions than others. So why was South Korea able to do it, and why not Argentina and South Africa? It's because in Argentina and South Africa, the emphasis was on investment, on increasing capacity, but not on innovation. So there was investment in increasing capacity, but not investment in innovation. And there were reasons why that was so. And that is a major reason why they were stuck in the middle income trap. So if that is the experience worldwide, what are the lessons for Bangladesh? So the lesson for Bangladesh would be not just investment, but also innovation. We want our private sector to also innovate. We need investment not just in expanding capacity, but in improved products, more efficient processes, and agile business models. So we need a private sector which is driven by innovation and not just by investment. Investment is important, but we need innovation as well. Now, for this to happen, we need the right incentives in place. So I want to emphasize the role of incentives. If the private sector has the incentive to innovate, it will innovate. There may be some constraints that may need to be removed by policy action, but if they don't have the incentive to innovate, innovation is not going to happen. So incentive is very, very important. Now, where are the incentives going to come from? That brings me to my last slide. Before I go there, so we are all talking about diversifying our exports, and we are also saying that let's go into more sophisticated products like electronics. Because once you go into sophisticated products, you learn a lot of skills which allow you to go into even more sophisticated products. You learn things in garments, but you don't learn a lot. You go into electronics, you learn a lot, and you can use that skills to go into many other products. Here, as you can see, Bangladesh is scoring very poorly on an economic complexity index, which has been prepared by Rubin and Harvard. And you can see countries like Vietnam were behind us, and they have gone out significantly. So, that's basically what I'm saying there. That we are scoring very low on the economic complexity index because our exports are dominated by a relatively simple product, which is garment. And this is what happened in Vietnam. It's a very dense chart, but it shows that in, I think it's 1995, Vietnam was like us, heavily dependent on garments. But they have made a transition, and their product composition is much more diversified, and they have a higher share of sophisticated products like electronics. And that's shown in a simpler chart here. So electronics exports, as a percentage of total exports, we were at the same level as Vietnam in 1995. And then you see the wide divergence of what has happened in Vietnam and what has happened in Bangladesh. So our electronic exports may have increased a bit in absolute amount, but as percentage of total exports, nothing like what has happened in Vietnam. So this brings me to my final point. I actually wrote an op-ed in the Business Standard some months ago, where I said that the debate between protection and productivity, that's going to shape the future of the private sector in Bangladesh. And what I'm arguing there is that if the private sector knows that it can earn profits by using its political connections, by getting different privileges from government, then the incentive to become more productive will be diluted. They will be more interested in protection. They will want import tariffs and cash subsidies and all that. For example, if you look at electronics, it's getting, under the Made in Bangladesh policy, getting a lot of tariff protection. It may be okay at the beginning, but this kind of protection dilutes the incentives. It spoils the entrepreneurs. They are more interested in preserving the protection than in improving their efficiency. The same thing could happen with garments, where year after year, even though it's a 40-year-old industry, they're still getting cash subsidies every year on one pretext or the other. So therefore, the question that we can ask is that we want a policy regime which encourages competitiveness and innovation, and it promotes productivity and not protection. And a policy regime which encourages new investors, not the old, not the Adamji jute mill type enterprises in the private sector. So that is really the question: can we move towards such a policy regime which promotes productivity and not protection of a few enterprises? Thank you very much for your patience. It's been a very long.
Hello, Dr. Syed. My name is Chaturi. I'm actually from Sri Lanka. I've been here for about 9 years. And I'm currently a lecturer at the Genetics Brooklyn. And I think I'm going to have like 2 questions for you. The questions might have like some questions in between. But honestly, like I am like literally talking to you from like as a citizen who's coming from a very traumatized economy at the moment. After going through the entire presentation with you, there was a time in Sri Lanka as well where we were also talking about the development of Sri Lanka throughout the time since its independence from the British. We were very proud of our literacy rate. We were talking about the agricultural growth, the reduction in the fertility rate, etc. And along the same journey, we were very, I would say, distracted from the big picture, with the fact that, we were distracted from the big picture because the government was portraying this scenario to us where development is about, all this like infrastructure. Look how we are developing, because there's going to be a port city, there are a lot of highways coming up, and Bangladesh is going through a similar stage in their development at the moment. There are like a lot of mega projects happening in the country, a lot of investments, by putting the country into international debt, which is exactly what happened in Sri Lanka as well. There was a lot of debt, but then these business models the government implemented in the country were not efficient business models, so to speak. And they were innovative, but they were not innovations that were bringing profits to the country, which is one of the biggest reasons why the economy in Sri Lanka is in, chaos at the moment, and considered a bankrupt country right now. And so the first question is, how will Bangladesh in Bangladesh also there's like an inflation situation going on now, and it is estimated that the debt rate in Bangladesh will also go up in the coming years, right? So in these kind of circumstances, even though Bangladesh has like a very strong local economy and they're trying to diversify their exports and reduce imports and to maintain the balance of deficit payment, even though all these things are happening, how would Bangladesh respond if the country falls into a situation like Sri Lanka? Are the people ready to embrace a situation like that? That's my first question. I can ask the second question after you answer this question. If you like. Yes.
And to get undirected,
to focus on improving their tourism sector to bring, to increase more GDP from that perspective. Because, as a foreigner who's lived in Bangladesh for 9 years, I can very strongly, without any doubt, suggest that the protection versus productivity that you were talking about here, that has impacted the tourism sector in Bangladesh. And so there's a lot of protectionist economy going on in terms of tourism, which I think has discouraged tourists from coming to the country, meaning like they haven't opened their avenue for to bring more dollars into the country. Bangladesh is very beautiful. There are like rural Bangladesh is amazing, and I'm pretty sure if Bangladesh encourages more tourism in the country, if they open up avenues for community tourism, the GDP per capita can increase even more. So this hasn't happened for 51 years. Why? And does Bangladesh have expectations of doing so in the future? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mahmood. Myself, Shobit. I am an assistant professor at the School of General Education, BRAC University. I have two questions for you. First one is regarding the migration. Back in 2013, the government introduced Employment and Migration Act, Overseas Employment and Migration Act. Do you think that has been one of the major steps in inviting remittances in a legal way? Number one. Number two, because you already have talked about the policies, and this is what policy can bring to the nation. Number two is that this last slide, protection versus productivity. Now, I mean, you can say that my standpoint is a bit negative, that nowadays we are hearing that money from Bangladesh, millions of dollars have been going out, and Swedish bank becomes a Swiss bank rather becomes a general phenomenon in Bangladesh. Do you have any positive signs of that? That how the money of the general people, they are going out, and we are just facing inflation in Bangladesh? Do you have any insight? Thank you very much.
Mahmood. Mr. Mahmood, it's a fascinating presentation because I'm from a sociologist, but I clearly understand what you are presenting here for a non-economist. I have very specifically two questions. Number one, there is no doubt that there's an immense economic growth existing in Bangladesh over the last 50 years. But I'm wondering, over the years, we also observed the political instability, because for most of the time, politically, it was not very stable. If you look at the 1970s, then 1980s, then 90s, but still, this political instability has not made an obstacle to the journey of the economic growth. So why it happened? And number two, what is your opinion about the role of democracy in to achieve this economic growth? Thank you.
Well, Janet, two quick questions. One is, I think it's similar to that in terms of currently we have a foreign currency crisis, or you could speak to that in terms of how you see the way forward, the economic. And I was very interested about the fact that I think I read it right, that industrious then opening banks. But one of the many headlines in our papers these days about loan default and how people give themselves loans and then don't repay them. How do you see that impacting the economy?
I'm Vidya Mahmood from School of General Education. I have a question, which is, you were talking about entrepreneurship, and my question is, if we are having so many entrepreneurs but they don't have the sense of policy, so if there is no particular policy to guide them, how come the concept of entrepreneurship will be helping in terms of the development of my country?
I haven't studied the tourism sector that much, so I won't be able to give you a very pronounced why tourism hasn't developed here. But on the first point, as you know better than me, from the debt situation in Sri Lanka, the structure of the debt was problematic because a lot of the debt was short-term and taken in the private sector, right? So the interest rates are high, the loan has to be repaid much earlier. Bangladesh's debt structure has been very different. There has been some increase in private sector borrowing in recent years, but overall it has been mostly with the multilateral and bilateral partners like the World Bank, the IMF, the West government, Japanese government, etc., where the maturity is much longer, 30 years, 40 years, and the interest rates are much lower. So that has been the situation, and because of that, the debt, economists usually look at two indicators. One is an indicator of liquidity, and one is an indicator of solvency. So one is the total debt divided by GDP, the other is the total debt servicing divided by your foreign exchange earnings. And Bangladesh is significantly below, and is considered to be a danger zone. On both indicators, Bangladesh is significantly below, right? Now the question is, with increases, as you said, our debt service obligations are going to increase in the coming years. Now IMF did a very rigorous debt sustainability analysis of Bangladesh about 4 or 5 months ago. And recently at Met Government, they may have updated it. But even there, they said that under different scenarios, including very pessimistic scenarios, of export growth, of GDP growth, and Bangladesh still has a considerable headroom in terms of its debt repayment obligations. So because of the structure of the debt, Bangladesh has usually been very conservative in acquiring foreign debt. We are in a better situation than where Sri Lanka was. Secondly, as you know better than me, Sri Lanka's foreign exchange earning got a big jolt because of the Easter bombings first, and then because of COVID, because you are very dependent on tourism. And tourism, like many other commodities, it can widely fluctuate. That's not the case with our major source of oil, which is garments, but even with remittances, is not subjected to such wide swings. So that's another reason why Bangladesh's prospects in terms of this situation are actually relatively better, even after you take into account the increase in debt service that's going to happen. Right now, we have a little problem because we are not getting enough foreign exchange through the official channels to meet our import requirements. And that's where the government is trying to balance things and then see how the purpose to do it. Now, on the remittances, as I was saying, a lot of remittances come through informal channels. So it's not coming to the government, and therefore you cannot fund a lot of the imports. But the money may be coming into the rural areas. So people often talk about a vibrancy we see in the rural areas, because unofficial money, remittances, are still coming in. We don't have a good handle on it because we don't have good ways to measure it, but it's quite possible that it has actually increased because the number of migrant workers has increased in recent years. So one part of the economy, the rural part of the economy, may actually be doing quite well, and that may still be keeping us afloat. So we have to look at different parts of the economy and say, surely, as I said, there are some liquidity concerns now in terms of the foreign exchange, but the overall situation, I think, is still better. However, and I think that comes to your comment, there are some deep-rooted, what I call governance-related issues, and one of them is the banking. Now, many years ago, after finishing my master's, I went to Professor Sobhan and said, can I work with you? And he got me involved in a project, and we wrote what is probably the first in-depth study on the problem of defaults. And little did we know at that time that 40 years later, that problem will not only remain with us, but will actually become serious. So that's where I think we don't know the exact situation, but that's a potentially, catastrophic is a strong word, but a serious problem, because a lot of money is probably not going to be repaid, and many of the banks are somewhat in a good condition. But that's one of the fault lines. In general, I think the problem for Bangladesh is rising cronyism. So I didn't mention it today, but I often talk about this. But Bangladeshi government, successive governments have had what I call is a business-friendly policy regime. So different kinds of policies which help businesses in general. What we have not yet had is what are called market-friendly policies. We talk about a market economy, but a true market economy is one where competition is promoted. We still don't have a very strong market-friendly orientation in the government. What we may be having is a movement in the other direction, which is called crony-friendly policies. So we need to move from business-friendly to market-friendly policies. There's a risk that we may be moving in the other direction, and that I see as a major challenge. So whether you talk about the defaults or capital flight, as you said, for the banking sector, whether you talk about these sweet deals in the energy sector, there are many other examples where there is cronyism, where it may be coming to a stage. Cronyism is not always bad in the sense that sometimes the cronies are quite effective at delivering what they were asked to deliver. But the time comes, and this is happening even in countries like Korea, where it starts having a very serious impact on development. Now, I'm trying to remember the other question, your question on entrepreneurship and policy. As I was saying, I mean, there are policies which promote entrepreneurship, as I said, but often the policy changes or the policy actions are not fast enough. Government has a more incremental approach in Bangladesh. So you may have entrepreneurs going into activities. In fact, what I'll say here is, as technology is advancing, opportunities are being created for new kinds of businesses. And I think Bangladesh's policy regime and the regulatory regime are still not ready. So for example, when Uber came here, 3 years ago or whatever, I know that the government was confused. Is this a taxi company? Is this an internet platform? Or is it something else? Because they haven't encountered a company like this before. And the regulatory framework of the government, they couldn't fit it in any. When they looked at the road transport laws and looked at the telecom laws, there wasn't a clear fit. And that's why this industry was actually in a gray area for a long, long time. So the problem there was not problematic regulations, it was the absence of a regulation. And regulations are important to clarify the rule of the game. So as technology advances, many such opportunities come for entrepreneurs. And one of the barriers they're going to face is the absence of laws and regulations. Let me mention another anecdote. It also involves Akbar Ali Khan. So, as you may know, about 15 years ago, he was made the chairman of something called the Regulatory Reform Commission. And Dr. Khan is a voracious reader. So, the law ministry had put together a very useful compendium of all the laws in Bangladesh, and he was reading through it. And he discovered that the courier industry, which was a very vibrant industry and very useful industry, was actually illegal. Because according to the Postal Act of 1898 or something, only the post office could deliver packages and letters and all that. This is a British era law which had not been amended, which explicitly said only the post office could do it. So the courier industry was actually illegal. But in Bangladesh, no one cared. And sometimes no one caring is actually good. So now, the government, when he pointed it out, the government could have done two things. They could have gone after the entrepreneurs, that you are breaking the law, or they could go after the law, that the law is behind the times. Fortunately, the government took the latter step. So the Postal Act was amended, rules and regulations were enacted to make the courier industry legal. But this is one of many examples where the existing rule book is way behind the demands of the modern economy. And perhaps these are the kind of things you had in mind when you say, but if entrepreneurs don't have the right policies, what should they do? So yes, over time, many changes have happened in an incremental way, but there are still many laws and regulations, and also the absence of any supporting policies, because of which the unleashing of the entrepreneurial spirit may come to a point and stagnate. So we have to look at the policy revenue pollution. Yes, sorry, if you can remind me.
Democracy and development.
Right, so here and, okay. What is so big about some accountability? Now, in that model that I was describing, where things are happening in the real economy, problems are being faced, and people are talking about it, either directly or through intermediaries. And that information comes to the government, and in some ways, slowly but surely, the government reacts. But is that a form of accountability? Some may say it is. And when that type of accountability is there, and is there in a sustained manner, you will see some development. Or if the government feels accountability, that we want to connect the villages of Bangladesh to the broader market. So let's invest in expanding the rural road network. Now, what is it? Is it a dictator, like this was during Ershad's time, just dreaming about it? Or is it some sort of accountability? Because things were happening, people were talking about it, and the government said, let's respond. So if you study in depth the policy dynamics, and that's why I got so interested in this subject, is because it tells you how government reacts to things that are happening. And some of the reaction may show a certain degree of accountability, which is what we expect from a democratic system. So even in a less than perfect democracy, if some of these other things happen, you may have development. But after a point, the process may stop. And that is where the absence of true democracy in all its dimensions become critical. So I think this subject of the role of the relationship between democracy and development needs to be studied, but for that you have to unbundle both concepts. You have to unbundle the concept of democracy and would unbundle the concept of development. Because otherwise, I mean, we can say different things, different people will have different views, but one needs to unbundle that concept. And then we need to figure out where the absence of some sort of democracy nonetheless allows development to happen, and where it gets stalled because you don't have full democracy.
What are those pockets? So, the unbundling is one thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure, what you mean, the criteria by which, one would unbundle. Perhaps different disciplines would come at it differently. But, you said that once you've unbundled, then you can see the pathways that allow for development to happen, even at the seeming absence of democracy or some semblance of it, or where where the pathways might get blocked. So is there a prescriptive, or is it all very context based? And what would be some of your kind of predictions and projections for Bangladesh? Like, what would be some red flags?
No, so if we start unbundling democracy, one is the obvious one we all talk about, that a government should face the prospect of having to face the electorate and being voted out of office. So that prospect, how does it affect the way government behaves? The other aspect is, as I was saying, accountability at a different level. Does government feel accountable to different parts of the population? And if so, how does it affect its behavior? Because a lot of people say that even if a lot of corruption is tolerated in the government, there is still a force within government which says there are certain things that needs to be safeguarded as far as the poor are concerned. So what does it mean? How does it work? Another aspect of governance is transparency. So for example, if a government is proposing a new policy or a new regulation, does government arbitrarily do it, or does it go through a process of consultation? If it does, how participatory is the consultation process? So that's about transparency. To what extent government is or feels accountable for results? I think one of the major problems in Bangladesh is government goes and does projects, but the performance discipline is weak. So it cares more about the expenditures involved in the projects, but less so about the outcomes and the impact of the project. So these are all, if you want to unbundle democracy, one may unbundle it in this way, or one may say, no, by democracy I just mean two things. Do people have the freedom to organize and criticize the government? And every 5 years, do people have an opportunity to participate in the field election? I was just trying to go beyond that. And that's what I meant by unbundling. Because once you do that, then you can start linking it to processes which ultimately affect development. But it's very difficult to say where exactly we are. But my interest would be in this kind of unbundlings, because only then we can go beyond the somewhat rhetorical discussion to maybe even discovering some entry points. Now, this is not an apology and not a justification for the current state of affairs. It's just sort of some ideas about where inquiry by different disciplines can take us.
Recently, even on 3rd December, I have read news that 4 of the factories of dirt group, which are situated in Himayatpur near Tasava. So these 4 factories have been shut down. As a result of that has unemployed more than 10,000 workers. So it is really alarming, because in this LC crisis and reserve crisis, at this moment, if we just shut down and close only 100 of the factories, maybe we will will face the unemployment of 5 lakhs to 1 million workers, because some of our garments factories have nearly 30 to 40,000 workers, right? So how to come out from this over dependency on garment sector? This is one, which is very important, number one. And number 2 is the way we are opting out from the agricultural enterprise over the years. For example, I'm a part-time farmer. I would rather say it, and I'm sure that based on your experience, you would also agree that in case of farming or agriculture, most of the Bangladeshi agricultural workers or the people who are involved, they are the part-timers like me. I saw my father never regretted because of the agricultural activities, but over my experience after the demise of my father over 10 years, I have experienced loss in every year because the money that I invest on my own land, that actually does not turn out to be a profitable business for me at all. Rather, I would prefer to go for buying rice from the market. Even I have come out from the cultivation of mustard seed because that does not become profitable to me. So how to decrease the over dependency on garment sector as well as how to create the enterprise and profitable a sort of environment for the agricultural production. I know that production has been increased because of the high yielding varieties, but that does not or that should not be the case. Rather, it should be profitable so that our kind of people feel like, okay, let's go for enterprise in the agriculture instead of teaching at BRAC University. That is my point of view. So how to do it actually? Would you please answer? Thank you.
So the first one, the first thing to ask is, coming back to the question of incentives, are there policies in place which are creating undue incentives for people to continue to invest in garments? And economists in Bangladesh have mentioned 2 or 3 kinds of biases. The first bias is an anti-export bias. So the policies and incentives are such that people would rather produce something for the domestic market instead of exporting. So that's one part of the diversification story. Secondly, as I was saying, within garments, there is still another concentration in a few products. And apparently that's also because you have another set of biases where producers of shirts and jackets and trousers, the traditional products, they are favored over those who want to go into newer garment products. So as I said, the diversification story can be thought of at least at 2 levels. There's still a lot of scope to diversify within garments, and there may be various constraints which is preventing our garment entrepreneurs from doing that. In fact, somebody told me that unlike t-shirts or trousers or sweaters, which are easily replicable, so I see you making t-shirt, I can quickly learn how to do it. But if you go into more sophisticated outerwear, all these new type of exercise dresses that are coming up, it's not so easy for me to learn just by what you do. And that's one reason apparently why that diversification is not happening. But there's still scope to diversify within garments. So one of the things is to look at whether there are any disincentives in the policy. As I said, once the private sector has the incentive, they can find out how to address the constraints. But then there may still be constraints that the private sector itself cannot resolve, and that's where public action will be needed. So there have been a lot of studies on diversification, what kind of policies are required. The World Bank, for example, did a very detailed study a couple of years ago, and you may want to consult that. On agriculture, well, firstly, is agriculture generally having a problem of profitability, or is a particular case that in your case, you are not finding it profitable, or you're not finding it profitable to make the effort, given the other opportunities that you have, to go and make your farms profitable? Because clearly, as I showed there, agriculture is growing. So surely there are many farmers who are finding agriculture profitable. So it's not that agriculture has lost its profitability per se. There are different people, given their different opportunity sets and constraints, may not find it profitable. Then the question is, can you easily come out of that? One problem in Bangladesh is people find it difficult to come out of an activity which they may have started many years ago, or which they may have inherited from their parents for bankruptcy law reasons, other reasons, right? So unlike in America, when people switch from one activity to another quite easily, so that's the other factor. So you may be stuck in that because you have a vested interest, given your other engagements, other opportunities, you may not find it profitable. You'll take much effort, and yet for some reason you're not feeling like coming out of it. In a sense, that's the Adamji story. So when the talk of Adamji jute being closed down started, there was a lot of on stability being high. Eventually it happened, and we saw the results were actually good. Not necessarily of everyone, but on average the results were good. So coming out of something is also not easy. Now, I don't know your personal case good enough, but these are like the thoughts which were triggered in my mind when you mentioned growth together.
Thank you. Thank you. We reached the end of our time. অনেক ধন্যবাদ। খুব সহজ সরলভাবে very perceptively our এবং most important and in a very positive, optimistic way. We've gone through our journey, what lies ahead. There is no fear in spite of what people are talking about. Everything's going to end and we're going to be another Sri Lanka. It may happen, but it's not going to be happening immediately. There's a lot of things happening that have been good, very positive. And yes, market, some people lose, some people benefit. The whole thing is whether the market itself is growing, whether productivity increases are happening, and through that, of course, generating profits. So maybe you're not suited to be a farmer. Maybe you should stick to your BRAC job. You cannot do that. But what I really liked is you leaving us with a sense of optimism. And the one thing I try to explain to people about my students, that in spite of political corruption, which of course is not good in the long run maybe, but the absence of democracy, in spite of all that, we've had, the timeline started kind of from the 80s and then end of the last century, really moving forward, but starting from the 80s. We've had military dictatorships, we've had the Khaleda governments, we've had Hasina governments, and it seems both in terms of economic growth and in terms of the social indicators, it's been positive. Whether it's going to be continuing for a long time, and again, we have to wait and see. But yes, corruption is taking its toll. That's one thing that you point out. But it should not be ascribed to American Cabernet or to American Cabernet. It's not that. And also, there is, in our culture, actually it's also in the other Bengal too, in both parts of Bengal, this tendency of political posturing, a political sloganeering statement. What I liked is you rounding all of this. So for example, agricultural productivity, the negatives of that, or even what the World Bank and IMF is suggesting. And Adamji, I remember when the Adamji Jindal was closed down, because at that time, the Janabito, Bashar Bhai's Shate, of course it was a Chilawan thing, but there was this tendency, they to condemn this as IMF and the World Bank trying to close this down, but we see it was extremely positive. Surprised me. But what is to ground understanding and analysis in terms of good data, in terms of see what's going on, and that's what's come out from their presentation. So thank you very much. Shishkini.